Hello, thank you so much for joining us. Seeing a lot of people, joining us from different corners of the world. This is a very exciting moment for all of us. So, a warm welcome. Seeing SFF partners. I'm seeing SFF friends. I'm seeing other philanthropists also joining us. So, warm welcome. We're going to take a few minutes and give a few minutes for other people to join us, and then we'll get started. Hello, Maria. Oh, wow. So many of you. So great to have you all. We're going to be, looking into the chat box, actually looking at who is joining us, but also, feel free to keep interacting with us and with each other. So more people are still joining. We're going to take maybe another couple of minutes and then get started. Hi, Jackie. Hi, Julie. Hi, Mutesi. Imelda. Welcome, everyone. Maybe just like a little bit of. So we have the chat box that we are currently using to share where you're joining us from, which is wonderful. Keep sharing with us. We have some people from South Africa, from Brooklyn, from Kenya, from Malawi. That's really wonderful. I see Brittany from Global Health Co. From California, actually also. Hi, Stephanie. And so we have actually also opened a Q&A box for any reflections, question that you may be having for our panelists. So the chat box, we're going to keep using it for introductions, but also for any insights that resonate with what our panelists are going to be sharing. But for the Q&A box will be specifically used for the questions that you'd like to also ask to our panelists. We're also going to be voting for the questions that resonate the most with us. So you might be having a question and then realize that someone else has already asked that questions. Since we are so many of us, we are going to look at the most trending questions. And if you see a question that resonates the most with you, or with the question that you have, really feel free to just vote for it. And then we kind of see the most asked questions. And then we're going to be starting with those and send them to our panelists. And we are actually also going to be reserving the last 30 minutes of our conversation to and hear your reflections. This is our conversation. It's not just like the panelist conversation. It's all of us reflecting on how this sector is good, but also can be made better by all of our efforts. So I think most of the people have joined, and other people are going to be joining. So I'm just going to kick us off. Warm welcome and a very good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. So thank you so much for joining this joint session hosted by the Segal Family Foundation and Focus for Health. My name is Caroline Numuhire. I'm with the Segal Family Foundation, and I'm based in the beautiful city of Kigali. So Segal Family Foundation and the Focus for Health are sister foundations. They support social impact organizations by shifting the power and resources to impact leaders through grant making and community building, but also provide a lot of a technical support to our grant partners. So in this particular event, these are a joint town hall. We are going to be unpacking topics that affect our communities, but also our leaders across both contexts here in Sub-Saharan Africa, but also in the United States of America. So in this particular first conversation that we are very much grateful to have and honored to be having all of you joining, but also contributing to, we're going to be discussing the importance of funding organizations helmed by leaders from the communities and countries they seek to serve. So we are going to be confronting some of the biases and barriers that keep resources from flowing to important work. It's a very important trend that we have also observed during this particular pandemic time. So really stay tuned for insight from our panelists who are the impact leaders working with the community. They're going to be sharing on how to communicate this value to funders, and for funders interested in how to continually improve their own accountability to the communities that they are committed to. This is also the right conversation. So it's now my honor to introduce our wonderful panelists, the approximate leaders, fundraising, or even funding experts. So I'm going to start with Dr. Charles C. Daniels. He is the co-founder and the chief executive officer of Fathers UpLift. He holds a bachelor's degree and a master's degree and a PhD degree actually in social work. And while on the journey of founding and operating Fathers UpLift, Dr. Daniels has taught at Harvard University and Simmons University, has been a national speaker and writer, and has been appeared on numerous television and radio programs, including CNN, ABC, Healthline, Good Morning America, and WBUR. In 2019, Dr. Charles was chosen as the Obama Foundation Fellow, as one of the 20 fellows who were selected worldwide as a civic innovator, creating transformational change and addressing some of the world's most pressing problem. He co-founded Fathers UpLift with his wife, Samantha Fields Daniels. Welcome, Charles. And we also have Jana Kinsey. She serves as an investment director at the David Weekley Family Foundation, where she supports a growing portfolio of dynamic doers. And prior to join DWFF, Jana led Africade, a girls mentoring organization for more than 7 years, growing its program from 1 in 20 girls to more than 6,000 girls. Africade is also a grant partner of Segal Family Foundation. So her international development experience also includes work related to land rights, international criminal litigation, and customary law. She's from Spokane, Washington, but now lives with her family at the foothills of Mount Meru with 2 dogs. There are 2 dogs, 4 dairy cows, and 50 chickens. Oh, wow, that's wonderful. Last but not least, we have Umra Omar. She's the founder and executive director of Safari Doctors, who are also grant partners of the Segal Family Foundation. And she's from Pate Island, and she was raised in Kenya. She went to earn 2 degrees from 2 prestigious American universities. And after completing graduate school and working in Washington, DC, Umra decided cubicle life was not for her. Looking forward to hear more about that. She returned to Lamu and learned about a life-saving medical aid project that had been abandoned due to security concerns. In 2015, she launched Safari Doctors. The following year, Umra was selected as a CNN hero for her work. She's also a multi-award winner, including the Africa Leaders for Change Award, the United Nations in Kenya Person of the Year Award. Umra is also an Aurora Forum Goodwill Ambassador and World Economic Forum Young Global Leader. So welcome, Charles, Jana, and Umra. And as I just like I mentioned, this is not just like our conversation or the conversation of our panelists. We would like to hear from all of you. Please share your insights in the chat box. And if we have more people who are just joining us, keep introducing yourselves to us using the chat box. But also feel free to share any insights from the chat box. We're going to keep really like including those in our conversation. But for any questions that you have, I would like to remind us that we're going to be using the Q&A box for all the questions, and really feel free to vote for any of the questions that resonate the most with you, because some of you may be having similar questions to ask to our panelists. And before that, I'm just going to be sharing some of like the data that we have seen reflecting or backing up the importance of us having this conversation today, and why we see a deep imbalance, and why we think these particular topics deserve much more attention from philanthropists, but also non-profit funders and leaders. So there is a significant funding gaps between Black-led organizations and their white-led counterparts, where we have realized that with less than 2% of all international funding actually going to local organizations, we have seen that only 5.2% of grant dollars that are directed to Sub-Saharan Africa from US Foundation, and those grant dollars, they go to local organizations. We have also seen that like only 4% of US philanthropic dollars go to organizations led by people of color in the US. And this is a very interesting one, actually. Between 2016 and 2020, African-led applicants to the Echoing Green Fellowship program, they raised 90% less on average than their white-led peers, and revenues of Black-led organization in Echoing Green Fellowship applicants pool are 24% smaller than the revenues of their white-led peers. And the unrestricted net asset of Black-led organization are 76% smaller than their white-led peers. And across the East African region, only 10% of all funding for startup went to local founders, according to the 2017 study by Village Capital. And within SFF, we have also conducted a small study to really have also a deep understanding. And that analysis of the revenue growth of more than 200 Segal Family Foundation grant partners working in Sub-Saharan Africa showed us that expert-led organizations grew twice as fast as those led by Africans, despite real differences shown by the study in the ability to create positive social impact for communities. In terms of representation as well, we have 92% of US foundation presidents who are white, and 83% of full-time executive staff and 68% of program officers who are also white in those particular US foundations. And only 37% of people of color in nonprofit executive leadership position reported that their predecessor was at the same racial background, where 86% of white EDs and CEOs indicated that their predecessor was also white. And here we're not even mentioning about the unequal pay discrepancies in this particular philanthropy sector between white-led organization or white employees compared to people of color. So there's really like a need for us to dive into this particular conversation. And for people who know well the Segal Family Foundation, you know us for our authentic openness to hard conversation. And so this conversation might be one of those, but it's a very beautiful one as well, because it opens doors to reflections, but also authentically connecting as different actors and stakeholders in this particular sector. And we can't move forward if we don't sit and reflect. And that's what we're going to be doing today. So I have introduced our panelists, but I'm also going to be asking them to briefly share more about their work. And also I'm going to be inviting them right after they share about what their organization do to share their personal experiences of discrimination in the fundraising space. Charles, I would like to start with you.
Good morning, everyone. It is a privilege to be here with you today. My name is Dr. Charles Clayton Daniels Jr., and Fathers UpLift is the country's first outpatient mental health and substance use treatment facility for fathers and their families. Over 70% of the fathers we serve are Black, African-American descent, or another ethnic background. And what we realize at our agency is that fathers want to be engaged in their kids' lives, and it is our responsibility to make sure that they have the tools, the motivation, and the internal love to stay engaged. Thank you, Caroline.
Jana?
Thanks so much, Caroline. I am an investment director at the David Weekley Family Foundation, and we are a faith-motivated foundation with a focus on promoting human flourishing. And we do that by partnering with excellent organizations. And in our international work, we primarily focus on 4 sectors. Those are health, livelihoods, education, and justice. Our geographic focus is Sub-Saharan Africa, but we do have a few partners in India and Southeast Asia. We are very excited to be here to talk through what we've been learning and to learn from everyone else. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. And Umra.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for your precious time. This is Umra from Lamu, Kenya, as the founder and executive director of Safari Doctors. Almost everything what a founder should not look like in this industry, and excited to be part of this discussion and bringing the real stuff to the table.
Yes, thank you. Umra, we heard a little bit of an echo. Maybe for the next conversation, maybe you might want to get a bit close to your mic. But yeah.
Turn off the fan because it's hot and loud.
Sorry, we can hear you very well. Okay. Thank you. So yeah, we are going to start with our first reflection on the discrimination that, so you are the doers, you are the experts in fundraising. For Jana now, you are also working for a funder organization. It's really important for us to also reflecting on some of the intricacies, I would say, of fundraising, and how have you seen that affecting you personally as leaders? Charles, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So one thing that I grapple with, and many of the leaders of color that I have the privilege and distinct honor of speaking with on a frequent basis, is this notion of questioning whether your Blackness will be embraced when you enter certain rooms. So not only are you dealing with your own trauma connected to racism and its effects, you're also trying to make sure that you present yourself as a confident leader of color that can be trusted. To be honest, that's extremely exhausting. It takes a lot of strategic thinking, and it is very stressful. And I think it's one thing that we like to bring to the surface is how can we make it known as leaders of color that this is what we're thinking and this is what we're grappling with, in addition to trying to make sure that we present ourselves as the best candidate for funding to support our efforts. I think another aspect of this is to make sure that we can be trusted. Right. And I think this is very important for Black and brown leaders, because there's this assumption that you're not trusted. Perhaps it's accurate, perhaps it's inaccurate. However, the assumption and the effects of racism and oppression still exist. And that's something that we find ourselves struggling with trying to give voice to in certain scenarios. You have to be very careful. You have to make sure that you don't come across as too aggressive. Or in other words, who should enter the room on your team? Is this a conversation for a Black woman, or is this a conversation for a Black man? Are people really ready for your experiences as a Black person in this space? And I think these are questions that are going through our minds on a consistent basis. And I'm so thankful for the platform to really share where we are with this.
Yeah, thank you for raising the important component of trust. Jana, your take on this?
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that, Charles. I want to just give a specific example of how this played out for me. I'm now an investment director at the David Weekley Family Foundation, but I was previously executive director of Africaid, as Caroline mentioned. And one thing that really wore me down in that position was when funders would defer to my white subordinates. And I think one of the single most frustrating experiences I had was coordinating a donor trip to Tanzania with a foundation program officer. And we were very clear on our team that I was the point person for that trip. And I was in fact living in Tanzania myself at that time. And yet every email and request for information went to the white US-based development director. And I wasn't copied on those emails. And these were very specific logistical questions. What is the drive time between the hotel and the office, between the office and the project site? And you can imagine that made my job so much more difficult. Extra emails, misinformation, and it made the program officer's job more difficult too. And so that kind of thing, it wears on you, and it's just incredibly frustrating and discouraging.
Yes, and that can be actually like the hidden face of racism, because it also takes the form of the very, very small details that cannot be noticed on big screen, but also that affect people on a very personal level. Umra.
So statistics don't lie unless we try really hard. So if you're talking of an industry where 2% of the resources in aid and development actually trickle down to where it's supposed to be, then that's a pandemic in itself that we really need to pay attention to, and really debunking the colonialism in the philanthropy sector. And not just philanthropy, but also in the investment sector. When you look at a number like over 45% of startups are funded from Northwest, yet in a place like Kenya, only 6% of that is going to Black founded entities. So, I mean, having these honest discussions is really critical, and where we should have aid that focuses less on the science of operations and more on the art of delivery of these programs. My first encounter was actually at the first Segal Family Foundation network, where we sat down with my fellow colleague, obviously, and a donor could not understand how she is an employed staff and I am the founder who's not making an income from an organization. And it even crossed over to, sexism of, so who are you married to that's like bankrolling you? And these nuances that, might seem very surface are actually some major institutional challenges that we need to debunk.
Yeah, that's quite important as well. Sometimes how people are perceived, determine what they have access to. In this particular philanthropy sector where we are aiming to do good, but intentionally aiming to do good, we can do good without, redefining what doing good means in all the senses of the question. And so with the pandemic and, happening in 2020, a lot of organizations had very wonderful strategic plans that they wanted to implement, and COVID happened. And 2020 actually gave us gave a rise to a renewed surge in interest in proximate leaders, impact professionals who are from the communities they serve. They have been staying within the same communities, and for some of the founder friends who are here, and we've seen how many organizations coming to us. There were so many saying, the pandemic's happening, borders are closing, our communities need our help more than ever. How can you help us? So for the proximate leaders who are there within the communities, this has been a very big indicator of how crucial their work is when something like a new pandemic hits the world, and the people who are there have the right tools to do those interventions. So for you, how has proximity been a factor in your work? And what do you think more funders need to take into account when considering it as a factor in their own funding strategies? Umra, maybe you can start with you.
So for the pandemic, for us, it was a very powerful reality check to reorganize safari doctors, because we depended on volunteer doctors that would travel and come in here. We depended on a lot of logistics and mobility challenges that were hit by the pandemic. And so what that forced us to do is go even deeper within as a local-led organization, looking for talent, medical talent, that was local, and strengthening our institution, being able to leverage partners that do understand the need of unrestricted funding, and partners that have that extra sense of empathy, like with Izumi Foundation and SFFF, where it was like, engaging with our donors more as collaborators in us rejigging what we're offering. So that also allowed us, more than the government or more than any international organization, to react in real time, be on the ground, disseminate information, use languages that we understand, set up the wash stations, translate the COVID material, which was like almost like an afterthought, with all these WHO guidelines going out. So to really take this global narrative and localize it in real time with the collaboration of such valuable partners.
Yes, I love that reflection, because it brings us back to the element of trust, because I don't think that any foundation or any funder can provide unrestricted funding without trust that Dr. Charles touched base on. But also he talked about empathy, because I think it's one of the values that we tend to forget a bit in this particular sector. So I'm really glad that you were able to reflect on this. Dr. Charles, what is your take on this?
Yeah, I mean, proximity is definitely a factor. And I could say for us specifically, we've been able to be more vocal about what it feels like to be a person of color in this space of fundraising and trying to raise funds for your initiatives, and at the same time developing authentic relationships with funders that don't necessarily look like you. And I can tell you that since the pandemic, my most rewarding conversations and most authentic conversations have happened with funders that don't look like me, but genuinely love me. I've had great conversations with Imago Dei Fund. I've had great conversations with Fish Family Foundation. I've had amazing conversations with the Draper Richards Kaplan Foundation, where we came together and I cried with them because I told them that it was exhausting putting on this facade and trying to navigate being Black and at the same time appearing to be trustworthy, which I am, but at the same time, it could be very difficult to juggle when you're dealing with your own stress, your own vicarious trauma, specifically when you are parenting children and you are concerned about their future. So you take that all into consideration. I think when we enter these rooms and spaces, specifically as leaders of color, we're entering the room with a lot of baggage, and not saying that the funders aren't entering the room with a lot of baggage, but the power dynamics is different. And I think those conversations filled with empathy from funders themselves made a huge difference in my life. And I'm not sure if they even knew how much of a difference it made, but we have to be honest. There are funders out there that's doing it right. They're making the investments, right? They're making the sacrifices. They're saying, you know what? Yeah, we care about productivity, but we want to prioritize your well-being first. And I think as a person of color, I want to speak for other leaders of color, that we really appreciate those funders that are thinking about innovative giving differently and really prioritizing the lead of color, but also leaning into these difficult conversations that are so hard to have about racism and oppression. They're not ignoring that the playing field is different among leaders of color and white leaders, right? They're saying, okay, this is the elephant in the room and we have to deal with it. Now, what are we going to do? And I think that is the type of funder that we appreciate immensely. And I would encourage other funders that have not followed in that direction to definitely follow suit, because they are making a huge difference, those funders that are.
Wow, I love that. And thank you for all of you to remind us the importance of empathy towards each other in this particular sector. The work that we're doing is quite stressful in itself, because sometimes it puts us in the most stressful situations. Some of us are saving lives. But also, Charles, I love how you highlighted the beauty of also this sector. Despite any challenge that we are facing, there have also been tons of instances where people came together as humanity and were able to connect and share experiences and support each other, despite anything that can be a barrier to who we are. And that also makes a lot of difference in the lives of the doers, but also the funders themselves, because we are all human at the basis. When we have those authentic human connection, I do believe that then work can also be much more enjoyable. So for Jana, so you and I have something in common. So we have first worked for non-profit organization before working for foundations and as funders. And that also brings us a certain level of responsibility, because we understand what is the doer side, and now what is the funder side. So for you, from that funding perspective, how do you integrate questions of representation and proximity in your own funding strategy when it comes to your work?
Yeah, great. Thanks so much, Caroline. So first and foremost, for David Weekley Family Foundation, we believe that in general, those with the most proximity, the most proximate experience with an issue or challenge are best equipped to confront it. And of course, there are times when others bring new, fresh perspectives to a challenge, but we expect that they will work in partnership with and follow the lead of individuals from within that community to design an approach that honors the reality and experience of those who are most intimately acquainted with the challenge. So in a nutshell, proximity and lived experience is the first lens that we consider. But okay, how does that look in practice? Our first approach is to take a second look. As a team for the David Weekley Family Foundation, we're motivated by our Christian faith. This is a core part of our identity as a team, and we support best-in-class partners, both secular and Christian. And one commitment that we've made in keeping with the Christian character of our work is to ensure that we take a second look at high-potential faith-based organizations. So then, in order to increase representative leadership in our portfolio, we're applying that same approach. We make sure to take a second look at organizations with local leadership. And we're finding that the more that we do this, the more effort we put in, the more that we go the second mile, the more that proximate leadership is also becoming part of our character as a foundation. So then the second approach is transparency. We publish a year-end report on our activities as a foundation in order to be transparent about our work throughout the year and to showcase how we make decisions and how we're tracking against our own goals. One of the numbers we published this year was about representative leadership. We know that we have a long way to go, and we're looking to our grantee partners and peer funders who are further ahead of us on this path. In our applications for funding, we ask prospective partners to share information with us about their own goals and milestones, and we wanted to offer the same in return. When we see an organization with costs overwhelmingly weighted outside of their core countries of operation, it causes us to pause and ask bigger questions around that organization's culture and structure. And we feel like it's reasonable for others to ask us similar questions about our culture and structure. So the third approach is to share the burden. And this is something I didn't realize as an executive director, but the power dynamics, the imbalance that exists between fundraising staff in organizations and foundation program officers can easily be mirrored in the relationship between junior staff in a foundation and foundation principals within that same foundation. So within DWFF, our principal, David, has been very open about his own evolving thinking around the clear gaps in opportunity that often exist around racial lines. And then within our staff, it's clear to all of us that equity and then improving our grantee-centric approach is the responsibility of everyone on the team rather than the burden of any one staff member. For foundations who are seeking to work toward more equity and a more intentional focus on proximate leadership, this type of clear messaging from principals and staff leadership is really important. It can be easy to shift the responsibility to junior staff members. And when those junior staff members are also people of color, foundations may find that they're reproducing the inequality on their team that they're trying to resolve in the sector. So this is something I wanted to bring up because in my conversations with other Black or African peers at other foundations, I've heard this feedback repeatedly. Yeah. It is a very lonely burden to be the only person of color on a team and to feel the responsibility of improving the number of representative leaders in a portfolio and for focusing the team's interest and attention on proximate leadership. The power dynamics that exist make it tough for junior staff members to speak up, but often their bosses would be upset if they knew how they felt about it. And they might actually have more support from foundation leadership than they know. So again, it's something I want to flag for the funders on the call, but also for EDs and fundraising staff when they're looking for allies within the foundation space to just appreciate the power dynamics that are also happening behind the scenes. So yeah, I want to say again emphatically that we at David Weekley are not experts, but we are working hard to improve and increase our transparency around these issues. But that is a snapshot of where we're at. And we are very grateful to everyone, especially our partners who have helped us to think more deeply about this. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I love that. And actually, like for us, maybe if you can share a bit more about also our practices. What I love about our team, and our team hasn't even invited me to share more about this, but is the fact that we sit together as a team in those moments of discomfort. When something happens, we sit together and say, oh, this is not right. This is not feeling right. How can we make it right? And I know he's going to kill me for this, but, having also like, Andy, our ED, not blaming us as people of color, to raise these points or not calling us emotional when we are putting a highlight on some of the conversion that needs to be done. It has been very important, actually like a very unlocking component on our side, because we then throw everything that comes to us on the table, on the team table, and then we discuss them. So for some of the issues, we can come up with quick solutions, but for others, we don't have a fix for them. And it's very important for us to recognize that for some of the stuff, we will never have instant solutions for them. They need a whole philanthropy reflection. They need long-term engagement. They need having like a mindset shifting and injecting more components of trust. And maybe before we kind of like move to the next question, Jana, I wanted to really like I have your insights on, do you think if the Black Lives Matter movement hadn't been much more vocal in 2020, do you think a conversation like this one would be something that will be very comfortable having today?
I think it would be much harder to have this conversation without Black Lives Matter. It does feel like it has pushed the conversation forward in the international space much faster than it would have happened otherwise. It's hard to say in the domestic space. It does feel like there was some momentum in that direction, but that this was a catalyst and has accelerated discussions that were already happening and should have happened much faster.
Yeah, and then what is our responsibility? Maybe I can ask this to Dr. Charles. What is our responsibility as doers, but also as funders, to keep these conversations alive, because they do impact how we do our work and who gets access to the funding?
Yes, I was thinking about this too. I think that if you're in the United States of America and you're considering funding an organization, if we're not having conversations about racism and oppression, especially now, I think those are conversations that need to be necessary, and we're avoiding a larger issue, right? I think there's a huge elephant in the room that we have to be more transparent about and that we have to navigate, because if we're not having these conversations, I know there's this huge term around diversity and inclusion, but what should be included in these conversations is racism and oppression. And oftentimes they are, but sometimes we're talking about diversity and inclusion, but we're not talking about racism and oppression. So I think as a tangible, concrete first step, we have to have some of these conversations, make sure that these conversations are more in depth. I think secondly, as a responsibility of not only the doers, but also the funders, I think as doers, we have to be more vocal about our experiences, but also be vocal and take into consideration who we're speaking to. I think secondly, as a funder, I was thinking about my first grant from the Lenny Zagum Fund. To be honest with you, as a person of color, I do believe that the only reason why I received that grant was definitely because they believed in our initiative, but also there was a network, there was a connection, right? One of their board members connected me to them, right? We were told by the executive director of the organization, who was a very wonderful person, said, Charles, your application was bad, but we're going to take this chance. I believe that what was integral to her being able to take that chance with me was a connection of that board member. I mean, when we look at Black and brown leaders in this space, many of them do not have that network, right? And I think oftentimes we have to put ourselves in the position to actually take chances on innovative ideas, but also provide coaching. I think a Band-Aid approach is just the funding, but how can we provide the funding as well as the coaching and the support, and also embrace their experiences navigating as a Black and brown leader being impacted by racism and oppression. And I know that's a lot to ask for, but I think it's rightfully so. Specifically in the city of Boston, when we look at recently, there was an article that came out that stated that city of Boston spent $2.1 billion in contracts over 5 years. Only 1.2% went to Black owned and Latino owned businesses, right? So that tells me that these conversations are not being had as much as they need to be had. And I can also say that this mirrors what's happening in the philanthropy space. And I think we just have to be more vocal. We have to be more honest. And although we may not agree with what we're hearing, we have to leave open the conversation. I think that's the first step.
I love that. And before we talk about the benefits of this honesty for this in particular space, I'm just going to be sharing some of the reflection from the chat box. So we have Bahati Omar from Rwanda saying, I have experienced a state of debt. We are put in by donors that in the end do not enable us believe or that doesn't enable us to believe in the innovative solution that we generate. The whole narrative about keeping information restricted to a wider extent does not favor the strengthened collaboration. I also still don't really understand why most partnerships work for one side. We are supposed to learn from Western partners always, not the other way around. So thank you, Bahati. So Maria da Silva also said, with so many wealth African Americans and African businessmen and women here in Africa, example sportsmen, actors around the world, how much are they contributing in helping us Africans? Otherwise, I would not have to be subjected to all of the racism of not wanting to be helped. How can we tap into them or even tell them how difficult it is for being people of color just like them? Okay, that's great. That's a great point, actually, talking about the role of African philanthropy to support African causes. So Umra, if you could reflect a little bit on the importance of honesty, empathy, and a connection that is not biased in any way, how do you feel that would benefit the doers?
So that would benefit what? Come with that last part, Caroline?
So if we, in this particular sector, were to have like a, open honesty and collaboration and trust, how would you see that benefiting the doers or the grant partners for some of?
Very critical for us to get beneath the superficial fluff of, the numbers and, all the focusing more on the accounts as opposed to what's happening, and because of not having that trust. And I'm going to jump into Stephanie Koopman's comment, I think from the Segal Foundation, because I see that there. Talking about how great a study would be about how much more impactful, as opposed to talking about color. And to me, that in itself is an interesting question, is that if we're talking of this very under-resourced and, mistrusted and underdeveloped sector, it's another one of those discussions of, where the numbers, let's prove that wants to kind of set aside the narratives that Jana and Dr. Charles and, and we're talking about. And then that maybe we need to work a little harder in quantifying and justifying how impactful this grassroots-led organization. And to that, I would say, there's a lot of studies around that. The Journal on Public Health talks about community-based interventions all the way from the United States and up here. So it's not like this new phenomenon, like, rocket science that we just came up with. At the University of Nairobi, they've had studies in particular counties on why interventions should be geared toward working at the grassroots. And some of these studies have shown, there's a less bottom-heavy burden on working with such entities. There's more of a proven, like, real-time impact, greater value for your dollar. And now the discussions that we need to have is how do we support the institutional capacity to really bring out what studies have shown from a bottom down lens. So, and that now brings it to that question of the issue around the trust, the empathy, and the compassion in the industries that we're working in. At Safari Doctors, we push a lot with the storytelling and really getting our partners to be part of our stories. That might not be, your 4 lines and a check to say 5 emojis or hearts, but it is what opens doors to having these sensitive discussions around the funding landscape that we use. So we do have to keep on coming back to the issue around power dynamics, whether it's class, whether it's race, whether it's geography, because that's what dictates the agenda. I worked at the Open Society in philanthropy side of the doers and donors, and for me to apply for a program officer position in Asia as a Black woman from Africa who understands Asian history is like almost a no-go zone. But you could have, a Russian who's never been to Africa in their life, and it's, you don't even think twice about it. So, these are the things that we need to really dissect, that whatever the study says, there is this bottom-down approach that we really need to be in safe spaces to have discussions around it without being put in the corner, like prove it, what makes you think that this person was really talking about your height or what's underneath your pants. And you don't have to, it's okay to come out and have these challenges put out on the table. So trust, empathy, the compassion in what we're doing cannot be taken lightly.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's quite important, actually. So I have a question in the chat box. Maybe I should direct this to Jana. I would like to know how donors measure trust. It's from Oriot or Izara. So how do we measure trust? We are talking about trust, and we also like to know why some of I guess like the stories behind why international funding or funders don't easily trust like a local aid organization. Then for foundation like yours and ours, how do we measure trust?
I'm not sure we have a measure for it. It's been hard in 2020. So I came on board with the foundation 13 months ago, 14 months ago. And without travel, without being able to sit across from folks and to see their work in person, it's a challenge. And so what ends up happening is you read someone's documents, you have a Zoom call, and then you start calling around to the other folks who fund them. And so if they're not already plugged into a network of funders that you know, or peer organizations that you know, it's really difficult for that organization to get into your portfolio. And that's just a reality of the time that we're living in. Typically what would happen, I mean, I haven't experienced this again because I came on right before COVID made travel impossible. Typically what would happen is a high potential organization that we would consider, but we don't have any reference for, we would go visit. We try to see them in person and build that trust in person. That's not specific to representative leadership, that's anyone. So yeah, it's a challenge right now.
Yeah, thank you. So Susan Davis just said in the chat box, Umra is sharing an important story about the bias that exists in the world that stems from our history of colonization as well as racism. I found that to be quite true when Grameen and Brack began taking on the role of donor or working outside of their own country of Bangladesh. Immediately it upset the natural order and the aid giving and receiving system, which is about power as well as resources. So thank you so much, Susan Davis. So keep sharing your reflections with us. I think the panelists are reading them, our team is reading them, but also maybe to touch base about how also at the Segal Family Foundation we measure trust, because trust is one of the key pillars of our values. Actually, it's one of our values. So we nurture trust within the team and within the team and the board, but also within between the team and the grant partners. And I would say, yeah, it's very hard to measure because, there's no 1 to 10 kind of like a, qualification of who is the most trustworthy grant partner. But what we use as our approach is really to say, if we think that you are doing great work on the ground, we already trust that you are committed to this sector. You are already trusted to be doing good for the communities that you are supporting. And then for us, that element of proximity actually that we talked about, having the team coming from the same communities or living in the same communities as the doers in the communities allows us to interact much more with the work and the leaders of the organization that we are supporting. And then we believe that we are journeying with the organization. It's not just about money. It's not just about the funding. So, maybe you might seem not trustworthy because you haven't benefited from technical support to build internal systems. It can be financial management, can be leadership, can be monitoring and evaluation to track your impact and communicate about your impact. And then for us as a foundation, then we invest in availing those resources and technical support to the doers or the organization that we are working with to ensure that they reach a level where they can comfortably share a financial report that is well audited, that is well sound. But prior to that, we also we have learned that it's very important to be patient to some level with grant partners when they're building those systems, because some of them don't have them. One, because they haven't necessarily had enough background or experience, additional experience in building those systems. But for others, they don't have enough resources to actually buy, let's say, a QuickBooks software, or having a monitoring and evaluation director who can also lead a team, because that also brings us back to having access to resources, financial resources to invest into those systems. Sorry, I was on mute. So yeah, the next question goes to Charles. So what should funders not make good on commitments to fund more equitably?
I'm sorry, what was that again, Carol? I'm sorry.
So yeah, sorry, I have been on mute, but what should funders not make good on commitments to fund more equitably?
You know, I was thinking about this too. You know, I think one of the barriers is for I would say for what we see is the funders not necessarily knowing where we are, right? And, you know, what we do and our approach to doing it, right? I think oftentimes when we look closer to the communities that are more under-resourced, that don't necessarily have as much access, we'll find innovative approaches to addressing some of the world's most pressing issues, right? So I think looking a little bit harder. Also, I think typically, you know, we want to make sure that individuals that that are doing the work are, you know, equipped, have the credentials, right? But oftentimes that credentials look differently, right? Maybe the credentials is someone that's living next door who cooks weekly meals, didn't have a bit of school, but if she had the opportunity, she can feed more people, right? I think oftentimes the emphasis could easily be placed on how many years you're doing the work, degrees, where did you go to school, right? And I think oftentimes, sometimes when we're focusing on those surface level things, it can blind us from the true potential that's within neighborhoods, right? I would also say in terms of how we communicate effectiveness and communicate success, I think it looks different. You know, to be honest with you, for me specifically, as a Black leader in this space, I did not have training on how to create profit and loss statements when I first started. I knew nothing about QuickBooks. I knew nothing about how to write a full grant proposal. But that first Leaders Segal Fund took a chance on me. They taught me how to do everything that could support me with getting the resources for the organization. And I think many leaders of color that are closer to the issue that can make a huge impact could benefit immensely, not only from funding, but as I said before, from coaching, from support, right? From having a network, from you getting to know who they really are and their experiences. Because if they had the same resources that some of our other counterparts had, I'm pretty sure they could be able to do a lot with those resources. As Lenny Zagum would say, he said, we give leaders who have the will and the dreams, the know-how, right, to be able to do it. And I think oftentimes we know how to do the work. People in our neighborhood know that we do the work. They would tell you that we're extremely effective. But the barrier is we haven't received an invite into the room, right? We don't know how to get to the table. And when it comes to sustaining funding, once we get it, when it comes to writing profit and loss statements, the typical stuff that I would say as a fundraiser, we have to know how to do, we've never done it before. So I think one of the solutions is how can you introduce us to that information? Or if you don't have the time to introduce us to that information, how can you make referrals? How can you make suggestions? How can we develop an authentic relationship? And I think oftentimes I would say leaders of color are expected to do a lot with a little, right? And I just want to make sure that in terms of being able to follow through and invest more equitably, sometimes we have to start from scratch and take those chances that we aren't normally used to taking. And that may require you to look outside of your portfolio and not necessarily look at the things that are more appealing to the eye, right? So, and if you would have looked at us a couple of years ago prior to that chance was taken, we would not have been appealing. I mean, the budget was horrible, the application was horrible, but there were several chances that were taken on us, and now we're here. So I think the theme is, are we willing to take chances and are we willing to have the tough conversations?
Yeah. And following up on that, what do you think, we talked about like a 92% of US foundation led by white people. What do you think will be their incentives to be much more inclusive when it comes to how they design their donors or funding strategies?
Well, you know, one of the main requests at our clinic and at agencies in our community, primarily serving Dorchester, Roxbury, and Mattapan, headed by leaders of color. If you look at the human service space, when single mothers, Black and brown single mothers bring their kids to us, or fathers come to us for support, one of the main requests is, I want a Black clinician. I want someone that looks like me, right? So typically those individuals have gone through several organizations where they've met with people that don't look like them, right? So we think about transparency, we think about being able to have someone that you can look at and actually look up to who look like you. People need that regardless of what country they're in. I think secondly, right, if you are closer to the issue and you know the population a lot, right, why fund an organization that's headed by a white leader to come in and do something that the person who's there know how to do well themselves? As a matter of fact, there's already an established trust. I think with the resources in that community, they can do just as more than someone who came from outside the community with a solution to try to say, hey, I want to help this community. And typically our community members do not need saviors. I think sometimes there's a savior complex, right? Where, you know, we have individuals entering the community trying to save our people, right? We need alliances, but we don't need saviors. And we also need chances to be taken on us. So I would say that's the incentive, right? You know, people in our communities want individuals that look like us, that understand us, to serve us. Not saying we are not, that we're opposed to individuals that don't look like us serving us, but there's a lot of them in our community, right? How can we equalize the playing field?
Yeah, thank you. Umar, so what is your take on what funders should know to make good on commitments to fund more equitably?
So one of the things that we tend to overlook as doers a lot is what we need to invest in capturing and obviously measuring what we do. Because we're so hung up on the doing, the numbers, you know, how many girls have you worked with, how many parents have you done, how many, you know, it's all about what your outputs are for the program versus, you know, what we are now really trying to focus in are the, you know, the research and evaluation, which all of these are like, you know, heavy components, especially when you're talking of that double-edged sword. You have like, you know, an early startup that needs to prove itself. And the one thing that requires you to prove yourself is an investment in this department that usually is actually an afterthought. So whether it's from your M&E, getting your log frames intact and having somebody who's really just measuring or a program and the tools and the, you know, the database around showing that impact, which essentially then is what answers the trust question of, are you showing that you're doing what you're doing with the money that's given? With Safari Doctors, I know one of the things that we're really heavily invested in was our development and communications. Because like, you know, at least we do the qualitative side of building that narrative. So really having our active social media platforms, our branding, and always communicating with our partners and keeping them in the loop of what's happening as one of the tools in setting up this stage. So if we're talking to donors and that relationship with doers is the institutional capacity in building these key pillars that then by default answer these non-tangible questions that we have around the relationships between the two platforms.
Thank you. Actually, you know, both of your reflections also, you know, brought me to a question that I had in my mind, but I also realized that Stephanie Koopman had also asked it in the Q&A chat box. She said, "How would you? What would you recommend to foundation, and how and what should or could they integrate into their grant design? Ask the grantees to deliver and give them the required funding for it to have the organizational change happen, at least push for more change." And actually, like Jana, it brought me back to a question of design. You know, we were talking about, you know, Charles was talking about how some of, let's say, like the financial management tools, you know, he didn't have them at the beginning. You know, someone told him like, you know, your application wasn't as, you know, as appealing as he would have liked to see it reflected. And I think that also, you know, brings us back to the component of design. How do we design our selection as foundations, and how does that design of who should be joining us also create that element of bias?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, every foundation has its own set of criteria based on the preferences of a board or a principal. And, you know, I think each foundation has to be self-critical about how that set of criteria is shaping the pipeline. So for us, what we're finding is that the approaches that I mentioned before, the transparency, taking a second look, sharing the burden, those approaches have stretched us as a team and have helped us to increase the number of proximate leaders in our portfolio. But we're still missing a lot of wonderful partners because of our general grant criteria. And that's particularly around the criteria of budget size. And so one idea that we've been considering is a pipeline portfolio, right? So this would be looking at smaller organizations that we wouldn't typically consider. I think for foundations who want to get serious about this, we all have to be thinking creatively about some kind of way to get beyond ourselves. And so for us, it's this pipeline portfolio. For others, it might be something else. So, you know, to give a specific recommendation, blanket recommendation for funders, I can't, because every foundation is very particular in what their needs are and what criteria is tripping up that particular foundation. For us, this is one thing that we've identified. For other foundations, it's going to be something else. But I think being honest with yourself, so transparency within the foundation, and trying to figure out a way to get around it.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's quite important. And actually, like a shout out to all the funders who have been mentioned in this particular conversation. We heard about Izumi Foundation, Imago Day, SFF, if I may recall, but also like for the grant partners who have joined us for this particular conversation. Feel free to really like make shout outs to all the wonderful funders who do like a very amazing work with you, who are very collaborative, who are very understanding, empathetic, and who understand where you come from, and who have been, you know, critical and catalytical to your impact. Please use the chat box to really, you know, share shout outs, because there are so many of other funders who are not necessarily on this panel discussion, but who are really doing it right. Let me put it that way. That would be a great way of also recognizing their intentionality. So Jehu Lekons, my apologies if I mispronounce your name. He or she said in the chat box that I believe that Black America lacks resources and connectivity. As Dr. Charles stated earlier, that we had to have a connection, even when his request was terrible, the founders took a risk on him. My question is, how do we get excellent funding mentors or coaches in the community to connect Black leaders to funders and resources, rather than making phone calls, sending thousands of emails with a real response? Dr. Charles, do you want to take share your take on this?
Yeah, that's a great question. And to be honest with you, I do not know if, you know, I would have had access to that person who gave a good word for us to have our first grant if I wasn't out there in that area where she was working. So we started our partnership with the Boston Children's Museum, taking fathers to see their children on a weekly basis. And this is where we had no funding. And this African-American lady named Charlene came down and said, you know, Charles, I want to support you. And have you heard of the Lena Zafel Fund? And me, I'm like, no, I never heard of them before. Do you mind doing an introduction? Right? So I knew nothing about fundraising. I knew nothing about networking. And to be honest with you, I truly believe that I got lucky. You know, back then, and I think now, we're starting to think about I've been talking to some people about how do you create space to get individuals with the ideas who don't necessarily have the resources, and begin vetting them and talking to them and providing them guidance. An organization called Social Venture Partners is doing something innovative with really bringing a group of individuals with these ideas together and giving them the tools of how to answer certain questions that are most common to applications, so they can have those application questions already in alignment. So when they get ready to apply for these applications, they don't have to pull out questions or answers out of the blue. And they're about to start that process soon. And they're going to choose to fund some of those individuals. And these are individuals that don't have a history of receiving funding. These are individuals that have great ideas, that are motivated. They've been able to examine how they're going to analyze and really invest in these organizations strategically. But I think that's the first start. But that wasn't around, or I didn't know if it was around. It wasn't around for me, or I didn't have access to it when I first started. But I think now We need innovative approaches like that to open up networks and rooms for people who know how to solve the issues, right? Who know how to contribute to the solving of the issues, who have impacted people in their local communities. But all they need is that network, and they need that opportunity. And I believe if more organizations like social venture partners, foundations could create those conversations, create those spaces, perhaps a conversation like this, just bringing individuals together with ideas and tell them some of the things that they should be knowing through a network dinner or annual or monthly situation would be greatly beneficial to individuals that were in my position a couple of years ago. Because to be honest with you, I think the age of Black Lives Matter has triggered this opportunity to have these conversations and to really open up rooms and networks to create positions for Black and brown people to tackle diversity and inclusion in those organizations. But we can't utilize a Band-Aid approach. How do we sustain these efforts? And I think we have to keep doing what we start now, and we have to open up our networks and environments for people who want to make a difference, who are making a difference in their community. Like currently, they just can't give you quantifiable data. They can't submit a profit and loss statement to you. And should they be kept out the picture because they couldn't do those things? How do we give them those tools to thrive in that manner? And I think that's what I'm thinking about. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, but that wasn't around for me. And hopefully that's a solution that we can begin applying.
Yeah, thank you so much. And actually, Emily Sylvan in the chat box also said, I find more of the more immediate needs I find more of the more immediate need for the funders is to re-examine the subcontracting agreements between big and or international NGOs and community-based organizations. There is a lot of harmful practices in this gray area. It is a good place to start when donors are reconstructing how they work. And this actually brings us to our guest last section of this particular conversation on how do we move forward, because this reflection from Emily also talked about the dynamics of trust and power, because big NGOs come and say, we need a subcontractor, an implementer organization who is preferably locally led, but they can't necessarily give direct the funding to the organizations. So Umla, what is your piece of advice you would give to organizations who are struggling with a communication gap with their potential funders about the importance of unrestricted funding in their work?
So obviously the Segal Family Foundation does a very good job of not just supporting financially, but the linking up with other partners. You have the smaller sub grants, whether it's for communications, whether it's for your staff retreat, tools like Catch a Fire, which you introduce to your grantees to be able to leverage the dollars that do come through. So one of the things is to obviously maximize on these in-kind and the networks that are afforded to organizations to fill in that communication gap. To tap into the comment that you just read before, the issues around sub-granting in order to then trickle down to the smaller grantees, is that somehow grantees, the doers are expected to adjust in whether it's scaling up programming or scaling down or introducing personnel or hiring a consultant. But yet you wonder where that happens on the funder side, beyond just releasing the catch. Does that mean that institutionally the funders as well is investments that need to be made on that end as well? Whether it's investing more on the cultural nuances, is it having a particular department that deals with that? Is it increasing the financial team for a particular disbursement? So how do we even out the balance, as opposed to, this sense of it tipping on this side because you are so used to this hierarchy of more accountability demands on the doers, as opposed to on the other side. And to tell to grantees that it's okay to say no. It's okay sometimes to be like, this relationship maybe it's not going to work. It's not for us. And not necessarily to bend over backwards in trying to fill in checkboxes that do not line up with your values. Like one of the first partners that came on board for us was an English organization that was just really pushing petty cash, checks and balance, da, da, da. And at that time, we're like, our accounts are all on one spreadsheet. You know, like we're not gonna fabricate things just in order to say, yes, we have, you know, requisition forms, we have these forms and everything. And we just had to say, maybe we're not meant to be together. And, you know, how do we make that an okay thing as well? So leveraging partners as well. You know, it might be a grant that you're not able to, but you have a fellow organization within a particular network. Just exploring something that's beyond just seeing yourself as being in a vacuum and having to, you know, tackle this head on.
Yeah, thank you. So Neha Pandya actually shared also like a very interesting reflection in the Q&A chat box that I would like to share with us. She said they have noticed that impact-centered funders may be willing to offer small grants to social entrepreneurs of color, but perhaps less willing to bet on those businesses to achieve meaningful scale. That has kept many of us playing on a small scale rather than achieving the heights we know are possible. Are there partners thinking about this? That's a very great you know, component. And I would like maybe, Jana, do you have a reflection on this?
Yeah, I mean, I felt this more as an executive director, and maybe going to the philanthropy side has blinded me some, but I did feel that push of, especially watching African executive directors at peer organizations get fellowship after fellowship after fellowship and these small capacity grants to learn skills that really they already had, communication skills. And these were people who were powerful public speakers, you know, things like that. And it just seems like, just give them some money. Like the organization needs to grow. They don't actually need another fellowship. They don't need exposure. They don't need more people to know their name. They just need funders to give them more money. And so I'm not sure if that exactly answers the question, but I do wonder if that's part of it. You know, a photographer who is trying to get business doesn't want you to repost her Instagram. She wants you to pay her to shoot your wedding, right? So I think that phenomenon is deep within this space. And it does seem to happen more to leaders of color and African leaders.
Because that would mean that like there's a huge unintended consequence of our philanthropic work, and we want to minimize that, because not inspiring organizations to grow as big as they shouldn't be one of our unintended consequence of our actions and how we like, you know, support them. So that's very important. So digging deeper than the founding story, what are the tangible ways to look for community alignment in organization work? I don't know. So there is, and it's like for us at the Segal Family Foundation, you know, having the leaders sharing with us why they have founded an organization is quite important. And when the founder is still, you know, within the organization, then it's even like a much more compelling for us to even, you know, nurture that trust, because we know they cared in the first place, and we know we know that we're gonna rely on them to like, you know, keep expanding that mission. So for you, Charles, so let's say if you are not within the organization and there was someone else who was leading Fathers UpLift, how would you advise on funders to look into the alignment within your work?
So I'm not sure I understand the question.
Yes. So let's say you know, if you are the founder of the organization, you are still working with them. So it's much easier for funders to come and connect with the organization through your story and through how you have you know, identified issues that were within your communities, and then created a model that was responding to that. But also when we are doing international funding, even fundraising, when the founder, the visionary person who was behind the initiative is no longer there, sometimes, you know, for other funders to like understand that's why, really sustaining that why throughout, different leaders who are going to be coming within your organization matters for them to understand, oh, the founder had this vision for the organization. And here we are now, 20, 13 years, I don't know, down the way. How do we sustain that alignment between, the founding story of the organization, but also what they are still doing and why it matters, and how do we keep funding that initiative?
Great question. Great question. I think, I am a huge fan of having honest conversations and seeing where you are. I mean, one thing that we understand is that people's narratives change, stories changes, but if we're not talking and you're only assessing where the organization is through an application, right, through a piece of paper, then I think that can be problematic. So if I was in the founder's shoes, right, looking at Fathers UpLift a couple of years from now, I definitely would want to make sure that I'm talking to dads that have been served by the organization. I'm also talking to individuals in the community. I'm talking to individuals in the organization about, okay, how do you see Fathers UpLift helping the world in which you're actually being a part of, right? And also because we are a Black, brown, serving and led organization, I would also want to know, how has racism and its effects impacted you? Right now, we do know that racism isn't going anywhere in the next couple of years, right? So we have to make it natural to have these conversations, because as a funder, I need to know what are some of the barriers that may be present that they're not physically saying, right? There's so much that we can learn from organizations in the community where they don't even have to open their mouth, right? And some organizations are dealing with, especially led by people of color, are dealing with, is it okay for me to share this amount of information? How much do I share, right? Or if I share too much, will funding be cut? And I need to depend on funding for sustainability. How honest can I be in this situation, right? So when you look at these things, right, and taking into consideration the effects of racism, taking into consideration the lack of resources that are provided to leaders of color, these are things that they're thinking about. And if we don't understand the effects of oppression and racism and how it impacts the organization, then we're not necessarily doing our due diligence. So if I'm looking at Fathers UpLift for organizations headed by leaders of color, I want to have those conversations. And I really want to understand it holistically, not just how well you're doing on paper, how many dads you serve, what is the data that you're saying, how much funding, do you have a diverse funding stream? And I understand those are important things to know. I understand, but it's also important to know how difficult is it navigating as a Black leader in America? How has racism affected you personally? What vicarious trauma are you experiencing? Is it interfering with your ability to produce results as much as you want to produce results? And can you even meet our expectations at this time? Should we lower our expectations? So, and I think if you want to work with a Black leader, can't work with them without understanding their journey in racism with its effects. I just want to put it out there. Racism and oppression is a real thing. It's a part of our narrative. And you have to understand that to really have an authentic and transparent relationship.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. So I'm going to be asking my final question to Umra and then Jana. And to all of you who have been such an amazing group of participants, I'm also going to be asking you the final reflection question. If you could summarize within one word what this conversation has been, I will really like and looking forward to hear within the chat box what has been your reflection within just one word. But Umra, to you, my final question is, what beyond the dollar initiatives have been catalytic to your organization's success?
Relationships. Beyond the dollars, it's been relationships with fellow grantees, with our beneficiaries, and the local rapport that we have of our communities allowing us to be of service, because you can't go somewhere where your service is not required, and with our partners that are able to, take pride in being a part of this journey for change together with us. So the relationships is what has made this more of a collaborative experience and a collective responsibility, as opposed to the savior paradigm. Relationships have allowed us to engage with the people that we do with humility, and it's also what gives our team that courage to step out in territories that, seemed are dangerous. So in Lamu County, being, I think, one of the only local NGO in a place where we can bring free primary healthcare and challenge the status quo, all because it was a puzzle that came together from leveraging our relationships. Is it a free hotel accommodation for a volunteer doctor that comes in? You know, is it hitching a ride on an aircraft after it's done its tourism rounds? So that is the biggest, I think, leverage that I would put next to the dollar sign.
Yeah, partnerships. I love that. And for Dr. Charles, if you could reflect on a piece of advice you would want to give to white-led foundation on why they should keep funding Black-led organization in the particular context of the USA, what would that be?
So advice on why they should continue?
So if you could give one piece of advice, I know you've been reflecting on this, but if you could give one final piece of advice to a white-led foundation on the importance of funding a Black-led organization in particular context of the USA, what would that be?
Yeah, I would say is that, you know, we can be trusted, and you will see that once you get to know us. You know, that would be my advice, right? Because I feel as if a good portion of my journey, and I'm not talking about all my funders, but I am talking about, you know, some individuals that have considered funding us in the past. A good portion of our responsibility was convincing them that we can be trusted, that we knew what we were doing, right? Even after the degrees, right? I think dealing with presenting yourself as a competent Black leader is extremely difficult, right? And I think, you know, we can easily say, well, you can have a conversation, you lead an organization, you're competent enough, but in the real world, that's not enough, right? That's not enough. And I think I just want to say, hey, we can be trusted, get to know, we want to get to know you. We're great people. And if there's something that we don't know, feel free to teach us or suggest someone that could. Guaranteed, if you gave us the opportunity, we would make a huge difference. So that would be my advice.
I love that. Yeah, and Jana, if you could also give your final piece of advice to fellow funders who are here with us today, who are going to be watching this particular session on why they should be trusting more local-led organization, you know, Black-led organizations, directly funding them without going through like, you know, all these channels of scrutiny that we talked about. What would that be?
I mean, it's just such a rich area to learn from. And I think if we all think back to why we got into this space in the first place, this is where it is. This is why we're here. And it's exciting and it's fun. And I think we'll all realize that there's so much to learn. And I also just want to put in a plug for our connections with other funders. For Africade, when I was an executive director, the most catalytic work that funders could do for me was not necessarily in the capacity building space. It was introductions to other funders. Because as funders, we have access to spaces that our partners don't have. And so if you can use that access on behalf of your locally led partners, you can be catalytic in this space. And so I have spent a lot of time on phone calls with peer funders, learning what their priorities are, sharing our priorities so that we can be beneficial to one another. They can share their pipeline and their prospective grantees with me, and I can share ours with them. And having, and not in a transactional way, but to really have friends in this space and to be able to share ideas and our own challenges and to use that access on behalf of our grantees. That's a really important job that we can do. So that's my plug.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you so much for being such a great panel to have this deep insight with. And before we end, I wanted to give a deep shout out also to the SFF board, but also to our founder, Barry Segal, who is also the founder of Focus for Health. I believe, you know, some of you have been saying how much SFF has been catalytic and, you know, I guess like a cool donor to go to. It really, you know, makes us feel happy. But I also I wanted to salute Barry's vision and in sense of integrity and intentionality, because for him, he really wanted to see true impact happening within the community. And I think that we have seen that translated in how we work with the board, in the structure of the board itself, in who is on the board, in how they work with us much more importantly. And this is not something that we couldn't be, SFF couldn't be who we are without Barry's vision for fighting for the rural guys, as we say always internally. He really love to fight for equity and the organization that don't have access to all the resources. Hiraka is a great advocate for all the organization that couldn't have been benefiting from this sector as they should. So Hiraka pushed us with the board to really, keep reflecting on how do we be much more inclusive? How do we challenge the status quo, as you guys were saying? And that's something that I wanted to highlight on behalf of the team. So, shout out to everyone. You were more than 250 to join us today. That's quite amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Umra, Dr. Charles, Jana, for having been such a wonderful group to discuss with and for inspiration. I was looking at the notes in the chat box. You've been inspiring leaders here, and we are looking forward to really, continuing this conversation. So as a reminder, this conversation was powered by the Segal Family Foundation and Focus for Health. And it was the Shifting the Power, Who Gets Funding Matters, and that it does really matter. That's what we're covering today. We are looking forward to having much more of insightful conversation moving forward. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your evenings or mornings, depending on where you have joined us from. So stay blessed and stay safe within this particular pandemic time. Bye-bye.